I learned, and the Governor-General himself confirmed this to me, that the elections were rigged, contrived. The intention was that the North should rule Nigeria. So as I learned, in a small way at first, but very rapidly I learned about the election fixing, and as I say, this was confirmed to me by the Governor-General. He actually said that he wanted me to know the truth because he wanted me to know how much trouble I was in.
They gave us a flag, a national anthem, a constitution, but beneath the surface, a trap was set. This is the story they hoped you would never question. The story of how Nigeria, Africa's sleeping giant, was set up to fail.
I don't think the British really wanted Nigeria to be a very successful country. We were dreaming very big, but the structures with which we were dreaming were already in trouble. Things started falling apart when Nigerian governments began that process of eliminating other Nigerians from the process of governance, ensuring that what belongs to particular groups of people we are denying them, the active destruction of the advantages certain people possessed just in order to exercise power without having any practical goals in mind began. It began too early, which is to say, by 1960, the idea of smashing the opposition, of ensuring that people do not overdream, had started in Nigeria. I mean, I always start by saying what went wrong began when Nigerians started sharing the loot of independence. And it was agreed by the ruling coalitions that some region would have to be excluded and some region must take over as many jobs as possible. And then all the developmental directions were simply seized by the leading party. Once you did that, Nigeria simply became an environment in which the struggle for sharing was more important than the production of value.
In the 1950s, a young British officer named Harold Smith was posted to Nigeria, the crown jewel of Britain's West African Empire. What he saw haunted him for the rest of his life. In one of the most explosive confessions by a former colonial officer, Harold Smith revealed that the 1959 elections, Nigeria's first so-called democratic vote, were not won. They were rigged to ensure that the region most loyal to Britain would dominate the new nation.
I learned, and the Governor-General himself confirmed this to me, that the elections were rigged, contrived. The intention was that the North should rule Nigeria. Even in '56, the Northern leaders were very proud and were saying, if they couldn't run Nigeria, never mind elections. They might not join Nigeria, they might leave. And we all thought, well, how would they survive? There were no industries, there's not a great deal of agriculture, some groundnuts in the north. This wasn't very practical at all. And then it was, the Governor-General seemed to be thinking that the North couldn't, even if it won an election, rule Nigeria by itself. The South wouldn't stand for that. So there had to be a partner, either the Igbos in the east or the Yoruba in the west, to team up with the North. What he didn't want was for the two southern parties, the Igbo and the Yoruba, to team up to form the government, because he believed the North wouldn't tolerate that and talked about leaving the Federation. So as I learned, in a small way at first, but very rapidly I learned about the election fixing, and as I say, this was confirmed to me by the Governor-General. He actually said that he wanted me to know the truth because he wanted me to know how much trouble I was in. However, before they actually ran the 1959 election, they needed money for the North and for the NCNC, Dr. Zick, to fight the election. So what they did, my senior officer, Major Bunker, went around, was ordered by the Governor-General to go to all the major British firms and international firms, Ford, UAC, Leventis, all these firms, and raise money for a slush fund to enable Chief Okoti Igbo together with the North, to fight the 1959 elections. The North got most of their money from the native authorities. This was looked on by the British as being okay. This wasn't corrupt because we were friends of the North. And if they tried this in the West or in the East, we might have said this was corruption. But because it happened in the North, the native authorities' public money was poured into the government party, the NPU. So this obviously was a terrible fiddle. We were discriminating against the southern politicians in favour of these northern emirs. What we saw was that this would not be the first act of treachery. They would have to smash the action group, because the action group was strong, and in a fresh election they would be sure to win. They were pretty honest and regular guys, and a lot of the British quite admired Awolowo for his brain power, and they admired Chief Inahro, who was a bit cheeky and young and spirited, and they were both quite admired, as they were like right-wing Labour people, nothing revolutionary. And so a great deal of money was raised by my senior officer, Major Bunker, before the 1959 election. And this was money put up by United Africa, by Ford, Shell, BP, and my wife, who was the personal assistant to the general manager of BP Nigeria. She's not going to tell you anything because she was a confidential secretary. I can only tell you that we were very well informed on some of the hanky-panky that was going on in Lagos. They knew that the North would do as they said after independence. If it had any, the North would just, because it was their habit, they liked the British, whereas the nationalists were an unknown factor. Actually, when they took the flag down and hoisted the Nigerian flag, not one of the major nationalist politicians was there. They weren't even on the platform. This was incredible. These were the people who had sought independence. The people in the North didn't want independence. They didn't want the British to leave. So this was a farce. And for most Europeans who were very close and watching this, we were disgusted. We thought this really had been manipulated, this election. It was unworthy. It was unworthy of the British people, this. This was no honest, straightforward thing that you would expect Britain, the mother of parliaments, to do. This was cheap and low and criminal. And I opposed it. And I opposed it then, and I've opposed it ever since. And I'm telling you the truth. And I was warned, if I told you this state secret, my life could be forfeit.
The British knew that Nigeria was not one nation, but many: Hausa, Igbo, Yoruba. Over 250 ethnic groups, different religions, different histories. Yet, for administrative ease and economic extraction, they drew lines on maps, merging ancient rivalries into a single entity, without consent, without logic. Then came the classic colonial tool: divide and rule. Ethnic census manipulation, unequal distribution of power, tribal favoritism. It was not unity they sought, but controlled chaos. 7 years after independence, the cracks split wide open. The secession of Biafra led to one of the deadliest civil wars in African history. Over 2 million civilians, mostly children, died from starvation and conflict. Yet, where was the international community? Silent. Arms flowed in, oil profits were protected, and once again the British Empire's fingerprints were found. On the weapons, the propaganda, the policy. Today, Nigeria bleeds from the same wounds: ethnic and religious strife. Oil wealth controlled by foreign hands. Politicians propped up by external interests. A generation disillusioned by broken promises. Every protest, every election crisis, every pipeline explosion traces back to a system not designed to serve Nigerians, but to serve empire. Nigeria's story is not unique. From the assassination of Patrice Lumumba in Congo, to the French hand in Rwanda's genocide, to the colonial-created famines in Sudan, Africa's most powerful nations were carved for exploitation, not liberation. Burkina Faso, Mali, Niger. Today, these nations are rejecting the old system, taking back their sovereignty from France and the West. The question now is, what about Nigeria? But something is shifting. Young Nigerians are no longer blind. A generation is rising, educated, connected, and fearless. They know the system is rigged, and they're demanding a new Nigeria, built not on colonial blueprints, but African truth. Nigeria was never meant to succeed, but we were never meant to remain silent either. To every Nigerian watching, it's time to unlearn their history and write our own. Demand transparency and leadership. Teach the true story in your schools, support Pan-African unity, and never forget our future was stolen, but it can be reclaimed. They set us up to fail, but we will rise to rebuild.